Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of Red Dead History. Today we'll be covering an intriguing revolution, which is one of the key moments of world history in the early 20th century. First, let's go over the backgrounds of four characters in Red Dead Redemption's depiction of the Mexican Revolution. Abraham Reyes. Abraham Reyes was born in 1881 on a ranch just outside of Mexico City. Born to a rich family, Reyes enjoyed a privileged upbringing. According to him, his nurse maid used to tell him when he was little, "Abraham, one day everyone will know you." As the son of a Mexican nobleman, Reyes attended schools in both Mexico and Europe, eventually being expelled from a Swiss school due to an affair with a chambermaid. Reyes eventually became a revolutionary guerrilla leader in 1911, residing in Nuevo Paraiso, promising social reform. Reyes inspired many peasants to partake in violent revolution against the Mexican army and President Ignacio Sanchez. Reyes initially directed his followers' anger towards the local governor, Colonel Agustin Allende. By October of that year, Reyes' exploits as the leader of the revolution were known as far as in the United States. But by 1914, Reyes had become a tyrannical dictator. Reyes allegedly ordered soldiers to execute thousands of peaceful protesters in a small village just south of the capital. He has also been reported to have been delaying democratic elections and of allowing civilians to starve. That November, Reyes spoke out against these accusations, despite widespread scrutiny of having reneged on his promises to provide liberty to the citizens of Mexico. He voices his belief that the country is, quote, at the point of entering a new golden age, citing the recent construction of a new presidential palace as proof that the Mexican people can work effectively together, and making plans for the construction of a concert hall and other civic buildings. Aspects of Reyes appear to be based on Mexican revolutionaries, such as Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and Venustiano Carranza. However, the revolutionary who most resembles Reyes was Francisco Madero. Like Reyes, Madero came from a wealthy landowning family and earned part of his education in Europe, and was still quite young in the early stages of the Mexican Revolution, when he challenged for the nation's presidency. Colonel Agustin Allende. Allende was born in 1858 to an impoverished family, although his uncle owned a farm that Javier Escuella's father worked on. Early in his life, Allende was an idealist, but age transformed him into a vicious cynic with a love of torture and sexual abuse. At some point before 1911, he became colonel in the Mexican army and the provincial governor of the state of Nuevo Paraiso, under the Mexican president General Ignacio Sanchez. Allende would use this power to exploit the peasantry by taking their land and selling it to aristocrats, while beating and killing those who complain. Allende then forces them to work on the land that they previously owned, for little if any compensation. He is also responsible for suppressing the rebellion in Nuevo Paraiso, led by Abraham Reyes. He seems to be based off of Victoriano Huerta, the 35th president of Mexico. Huerta's uniform is also similar to Allende's. Capitán Vicente de Santa. Born in 1877, Vicente de Santa hails from a family of soldiers, spanning multiple generations. Believing it would, quote, put the world in his hands, de Santa's parents had him study English for 6 years, under the tutelage of an old woman from Milwaukee. As a result, de Santa would grow to resent his parents. As a child, de Santa's father would frequently beat him and call him a girl. Although Vicente hated him for it at the time, he came to realize that ultimately it was the beatings that shaped the person he became. By 1911, de Santa had ascended to the rank of captain in the Mexican army, serving under Colonel Agustin Allende in the province of Nuevo Paraiso. De Santa is portrayed as a cruel, abusive, sadistic man. Regularly, he has personally participated in the slaughter of civilians that support the rebels. Despite Allende's abuse, or perhaps because of it, de Santa seems to genuinely admire and look up to Allende, seeing him as a savior of the Mexican way of life. Luisa Fortuna. Luisa was born in 1892. As a child, she learned to read, write, and speak English all on her own. By 1911, she is 19 years old and is training to be a school teacher, while also fighting as a rebel in Nuevo Paraiso. She is a very dedicated and zealous revolutionary, and is said to fight as well as any man. Luisa has fallen for the leader of the local rebellion, Abraham Reyes, expecting that they will soon marry. Quite to the contrary, Reyes simply views Luisa, among other women, as a peasant and uses her for sex, while forgetting or confusing her name several times, often with Laura throughout the game. Laura, dame la fuerza para luchar. Regardless, she remains endlessly faithful to him in his rebellion. Luisa is unconcerned about how Reyes views her and how he forgets her name. She still loves him, and still cares about his rebellion no matter what happens and no matter what Reyes says or does. Because of her love and loyalty to him and to her country, Luisa was willing to do anything for Reyes' rebellion. Now that we have covered the characters from the game, let's talk about what happened in the real Mexican Revolution. Let's first start by talking about the reign of Porfirio Diaz, otherwise known as Porfiriato, and some of the things during this time that ultimately led to the revolution. Diaz ruled from 1876 until 1880. He consolidated power and sought the U.S. government's recognition of his regime. The plan of Tuxtepec explicitly called for no re-election of the president. So, at the end of Diaz's term, a political ally from the federal army, Manuel Gonzalez, became president for one term. In 1884, Diaz abandoned the principle of no re-election and returned to the presidency, not relinquishing it until 1911. When Diaz came to power in 1876, the northern border of Mexico with the U.S. became a region of tension and conflict. This had to be resolved in order for Diaz's regime to be recognized as the sovereign government of Mexico. Native groups and cattle thieves were a threat in the border region. The Apache didn't recognize the sovereignty of either the U.S. or Mexico over their territories, but used the international division to their advantage, raiding one side of the border and seeking sanctuary on the other. Bandits stole cattle, and likewise used the border to escape the authorities. The U.S. used the border issue as a reason to withhold recognition of Diaz's regime, and a low-level international conflict continued. Diaz secured recognition by paying $300,000 to settle claims by the U.S. In 1878, the U.S. government recognized the Diaz regime, and former U.S. President and Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant visited Mexico. Diaz replaced a number of independent regional leaders with men loyal to himself. To further consolidate state power, Diaz appointed jefes políticos, political bosses, answerable to the central government, who commanded local forces. During the period of Porfiriato, Mexico was able to centralize authority, manage political infighting, tamper down banditry, and shift tendencies of economic nationalism to embrace foreign investment. That major shift allowed rapid economic and technological change, an openness to cultural innovation, increasing urbanization, and shifts in societal attitudes of elites. The slogan of the Porfiriato was, quote, order and progress. It affirmed that without political order, economic development and growth was impossible. Foreign investors would be unwilling to risk their capital if political conditions were unstable. The benefits of this economic growth were unevenly distributed, and social problems increased, including debt slavery of the peasantry and child labor in new industrial enterprises. The policies of conciliation and repression allowed the regime to maintain order for decades. In central Mexico, indigenous communities that exercised political and economic control of their lands were undermined by the Diaz regime. Through the expropriation of their lands and weakening or absence of indigenous leadership, expropriation of village lands occurred as land estates, often owned by foreign investors, expanded. Many Mexicans became landless peasants, laboring on these vast estates, or industrial workers toiling long hours for low wages. Foreign companies, mostly from the United Kingdom, France, and the US, also exercised influence in Mexico. This regime had sought to eliminate corporate ownership of land, targeting estates owned by the Roman Catholic Church and indigenous communities, forcing them to be broken up into parcels and sold. Despite their hopes, this did not result in the creation of a class of yeoman farmers, but it did undermine the integrity of indigenous communities and undermine the economic power of the church as well. These landholdings were deemed quote-unquote vacant, even if others were living on them. Their ownership would be invalidated in government courts to make room for Diaz's allies. Ruales would be utilized to dispose of peasants, and the peasant effort to reclaim native land would be severely weakened, given that they were often illiterate and could not hire lawyers. Diaz used coercion to repress democratic power, using pan o palo, bread or bludgeon policy. This policy was used to maintain control by offering rewards, pan, for loyalty, or using severe force, palo, for opposition, ensuring submission through economic benefits or brutal reprisals, like harassment, imprisonment, or death, especially impacting peasants whose lands were taken for large estates. This policy allowed Diaz to appoint state governors, who could do whatever they wanted with local populations, as long as they did not interfere with Diaz's main operations. Many of these state governors were corrupt and abused their power in various ways. During the administration of President Benito Juárez, a small, efficient rural police force was under his control, known as the Ruales. It was a tool used to impose order. When Diaz became president, he expanded the size and scope of the Ruales. They were under his command and control in a way the Mexican army was not. The construction of the railways gave the government more effective control of many of the regions of Mexico that had maintained a level of independence due to their distance from the capital. The construction of telegraph lines alongside the railroad tracks further facilitated the government's control, so that orders from Mexico City were instantly transmitted to officials everywhere. The government could respond quickly to regional revolts by armed rurales and their horses on trains to quell disturbances. There were also some philosophical changes in the government during the period of Porfiriato, such as social Darwinism, which was a concept by English philosopher Herbert Spencer. The central belief was that individuals or groups who achieve power and wealth do so because they are innately the quote-unquote fittest, while those who are poor or marginalized are quote-unquote unfit and destined to fail. This is what some government officials saw as justification of their rule, due to their perceived superiority over largely rural, largely indigenous, and mixed-race Mexican population. It seemed like a similar belief system as the casta, which was implemented during the colonial New Spain period, where Spanish-born Spaniards had the most power and privileges, while enslaved Africans and indigenous groups had the least. Wealth, political power, and access to education were concentrated among a handful of elite landholding families, mainly of European with some mixed descent. These hacendados, as they were called, controlled vast swaths of the country through their large estates. For example, the Terrazas family had one estate in Sonora that alone comprised more than 1 million acres. Porfirian elites viewed modernization as synonymous with westernization. They believed to be considered a quote-unquote civilized nation by the Western world, Mexico needed to adopt European, especially French, styles in architecture, art, fashion, and culture. Diaz had ruled continually since 1884. The question of presidential succession was an issue as early as 1900, when he turned 70. Diaz re-established the office of vice president in 1906, choosing Ramon Corral. Rather than managing political succession, Diaz marginalized Corral, keeping him away from decision-making. By 1900, over 90% of Mexico's communal lands were sold, with an estimated 9.5 million peasants forced to work into the service of wealthy landowners or hacendados. Diaz effectively suppressed strikes, rebellions, and political opposition until the early 1900s. Mexicans began to organize in opposition to Diaz, who would welcome foreign capital and capitalists, suppressed labor unions, and consistently moved against the peasants as agriculture flourished. After 1900, in an effort to bring more foreign investment to Sonora, Diaz initiated large-scale exterminations of the Yaqui people. Feeling increasing criticism towards his administration, the Diaz administration continued a long-held tradition of redistributing Yaqui lands, and the Yaqui consistently retaliated against government efforts to acquire their land. Once the Yaqui became a non-issue, American investors became more comfortable investing in numerous industries in Sonora. In 1905, a group of Mexican intellectuals and political agitators created the Mexican Liberal Party, Partido Liberal de México. They drew up a radical program of reform, specifically addressing what they considered to be the worst aspects of the Diaz regime. The most prominent PLM members were Ricardo Flores Mangon and his two brothers Enrique and Jesus. They, along with Luis Cabrera and Antonio Diaz Soto y Jama, were connected to the anti-Diaz publication El Hijo del Aguizote. The political cartoons were by José Guadalupe Posada, which lampooned politicians and cultural elites with mordant humor, portraying them as skeletons. The Liberal Party of Mexico founded the anti-Diaz anarchist newspaper called Regeneración, which appeared both in English and in Spanish. From exile in the United States, Parajides Guerrero began publishing an anti-Diaz newspaper, Alba Roja, Red Dawn, in San Francisco, California. Although leftist groups were small, they became influential through their publications, articulating their opposition to the Diaz regime. Francisco Bulnes described these men as the true authors of the Mexican Revolution for agitating the masses. As the 1910 election approached, Francisco Madero, an emerging political figure and a member of one of Mexico's richest families, funded the newspaper Anti-Reeleccionista, which was in opposition to the continual re-election of Diaz. On June 1, 1906, the Cananea strike took place in the mining town of Cananea in Sonora. Workers initiated the strike in response to poor working conditions and unequal pay between Mexican and American workers. Despite attempting to change conditions through an organized labor strike, the workers were ultimately forced to return to work without their demands being met. In the Cananea strike, mine owner William Cornell Green received support from Diaz's rurales in Sonora, as well as the Arizona Rangers, who were called in from across the U.S. border. The Arizona Rangers were ordered to use violence to combat labor unrest. In the state of Veracruz, the Mexican army gunned down Rio Blanco textile workers and put the bodies on train cars that transported them to the Veracruz harbor. Quote, where the bodies were dumped in the harbor as food for sharks. On January 7th and 8th of 1907, the Rio Blanco strike occurred. It was a workers' riot related to a textile strike that occurred in the town of Rio Blanco near Orizaba in the Mexican state of Veracruz. On January 7th, a stone-throwing crowd of about 2,000 rioted, with many attacks focused on company property. An initial clash between strikers and Rio Blanco employees who were returning to work led to shots being fired and the burning of the company's store, though not the actual factory premises. Ruales, led by local political jefe Carlos Herrera, appeared but did not intervene. On the same day, the mob ransacked the homes of the wealthy, released prisoners from jail, and went afield to Nogales and Ecotzla to burn and loot the company's stores as well. By the end of the day, soldiers from nearby Orizaba had killed 18. Hundreds more had been arrested or chased into the surrounding hills. Federal troops from Mexico City arrived on the 8th on the personal orders of Diaz. 6 strike leaders were identified by the evening and executed on the smoking ruins of the company's store the next morning. Conservative casualty figures ranges from 50 to 70 dead and hundreds wounded. Ruales' chief Herrera was replaced by Colonel Francisco Ruiz as jefe. There were accounts of rail wagons being filled with bodies of dead workers that were circulated by political enemies of Diaz's regime. At both the French-controlled Rio Blanco textile factory and the American-owned Cananea copper mine, PLM literature was found in workers' quarters. The presence of an armed American militia caused general outrage against the Diaz administration, as it displayed an inability to maintain order without foreign aid. While Diaz tried to limit American involvement by sending orders to Governor Izabal not to accept foreign aid, it was already too late. By the time the telegram had arrived in Cananea, the Arizona Rangers had already crossed into the Mexican territory to aid the suppression of the strike. Diaz publicly announced in an interview with journalist James Creelman for Pearson's magazine that he would not run in the 1910 election. At age 80, this set the scene for a possible peaceful transition in the presidency, but it only set off a flurry of political activity.
Contestación que el señor general Porfirio Díaz, presidente de la República Mexicana, da una carta del señor Tomás A. Edison.
Chapultepec, agosto 15 de 1909. Señor Tomás A. Edison. Ahora, estimado y buen amigo, me refiero a su grata 8 de julio. Yo también, como usted, recuerdo con placer el tiempo aquel en que tuve la satisfacción de conocerle y conocer sus atrevidos experimentos, haciéndome partícipe de su fe inquebrantable en el grandioso porvenir de las ciencias físicas, porque usted ha creado nuevas fuentes de felicidad, de bienestar y de riqueza para el género humano, utilizando las más poderosas fuerzas conocidas: luz, electricidad, trabajo y genio. Su amigo, que con orgullo estrecha su mano, Porfirio Díaz.
To the dismay of potential candidates to replace him, he reversed his decision. His later reversal from retiring from the presidency set off tremendous events among opposition groups. Another potential successor was General Bernardo Reyes, Diaz's Minister of War, who also served as governor of Nuevo León. Reyes was an opponent of the Científicos and a moderate reformer with a considerable base of support. Diaz became concerned about him as a rival and forced him to resign from his cabinet. He attempted to marginalize Reyes by sending him on a military mission to Europe, distancing him from Mexico and potential political supporters. The potential challenge of Reyes would remain one of Diaz's political obsessions throughout the rest of the decade, which ultimately blinded him to the danger of the challenge of Francisco Madero's anti-re-electionist campaign. In 1910, Francisco Madero, from the northern state of Coahuila, announced his intent to challenge Diaz for the presidency in the next election. Under the banner of the anti-re-electionist party, Madero chose as his running mate Francisco Vázquez Gómez, a physician who had opposed Diaz. Madero campaigned vigorously and effectively. To ensure Madero did not win, Diaz had him jailed before the election. He escaped and fled for a short period to San Antonio, Texas. Diaz was announced the winner of the election by a quote-unquote landslide. On October 5, 1910, Madero issued a quote-unquote letter from jail, known as Plan de San Luis Potosí, with its main slogan, Sufragio efectivo, no reelección, effective voting, no re-election. It declared the Diaz presidency illegal and called for a revolt against him, starting on November 20th of that year. Madero's political plan did not outline a major socio-economic revolution, but it offered hope of change for many disadvantaged Mexicans. The plan strongly opposed militarism in Mexico as it was constituted under Diaz. It called on all federal army generals to resign before true democracy would prevail in Mexico. Madero realized he needed a revolutionary armed force, so he enticed men to join with the promise of formal rank, and encouraged federales to join the revolutionary forces with promises of promotion. Madero's plan was aimed at fomenting a popular uprising against Diaz, but he also understood that the support of the United States and American financiers would be of crucial importance in undermining the regime. The strategy to discredit Diaz with American business and the US government achieved some success, with Standard Oil representatives engaging in talks with Gustavo Madero. More importantly, the American government, quote, bent neutrality laws for the revolutionaries. In late 1910, revolutionary movements arose in response to Madero's plan. Still, their ultimate success resulted from the Federal Army's weakness and inability to suppress them. Madero's vague promises of land reform attracted many peasants throughout the country. Spontaneous rebellions arose, in which many farm laborers, miners, and other working-class Mexicans fought Diaz's forces with some success. Madero attracted forces of rebel leaders, such as Pascual Orozco, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and Venustiano Carranza, an able young revolutionary. Orozco, along with Chihuahua Governor Abraham Gonzalez, formed a powerful military union in the north, and although they are not especially committed to Madero, they took Mexicali and Chihuahua City. These victories encouraged alliances with other revolutionary leaders, including Villa. Against Madero's wishes, Orozco and Villa fought for and won Ciudad Juarez, bordering El Paso, Texas, on the south side of the Rio Grande. Madero's call to action had unanticipated results, such as the Magonista Rebellion of 1911 in Baja California. With the Federal Army defeated in several battles, from regular and voluntary forces, Diaz's government began negotiations with the revolutionaries in the north. In the spring of 1911, armed bands under self-appointed chiefs arose all over the republic. They drove Diaz officials from the vicinity, seized money and stamps. They also staked out spheres of local authority. Towns, cities, and the countryside passed into the hands of the Maderistas. Diaz sued for peace with Madero, who himself did not want a prolonged and bloody conflict. The result was the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez, signed on May 21, 1911. The signed treaty stated that Diaz would abdicate the presidency, along with his vice president, Ramon Corral, by the end of May 1911, and to be replaced by an interim president, Francisco León de la Barra, until elections were held. Diaz and his family, and a number of top supporters, were allowed to go into exile. When Diaz left for exile in Paris, he was reported as saying, quote, "Madero has unleashed a tiger. Let us see if he can control it." With Diaz in exile and new elections to be called in October, the power structure of the old regime remained in place. Francisco León de la Barra became interim president, pending an election to be held in October of 1911. Madero considered de la Barra an acceptable figure for interim presidency, since he was not a científico or politician, but rather a Catholic lawyer and diplomat. The Federal Army, despite its numerous defeats by the revolutionaries, remained intact as the government's force. Madero called on revolutionary fighters to lay down their arms and demobilize, which Emiliano Zapata and the revolutionaries in Morelos refused to do. The cabinet of de la Barra and the Mexican Congress was filled with supporters of the Diaz regime. Madero campaigned vigorously for the presidency during this interim period, but the revolutionaries who had supported him and brought Diaz's resignation were dismayed that the sweeping reforms that they fought for were not immediately instituted. De la Barra's government sent General Victoriano Huerta to fight Morelos against the Zapatistas, burning villages and wreaking havoc. His actions drove a wedge between Zapata and Madero, which widened when Madero was inaugurated as president. Madero won the 1911 election decisively and was inaugurated as president in November, but his movement lost crucial momentum, and revolutionary supporters in the months of the interim presidency had left in place of the Federal Army. Madero had drawn some loyal and military adept supporters who brought down Diaz's regime by force of arms. Madero himself was not a natural soldier, and his decision to dismiss the revolutionary forces that brought him power isolated him politically. He was an inexperienced politician who had never held office before. His election as president in October of 1911 raised high expectations among many Mexicans for positive change. The Treaty of Ciudad Juárez guaranteed that the essential structure of the Diaz regime, including the federal army, was kept in place. The rebels who had brought him to power were demobilized, and Madero called on these men of action to return to civilian life. According to a story told by Pancho Villa, one of the leaders of the revolution, he told Madero at a banquet in Ciudad Juárez in 1911, quote, "You, sir, have destroyed the revolution. It's simple. These bunch of dandies have made a fool of you, and this will eventually cost us our necks, yours included." Ignoring the warning, Madero increasingly relied on the federal army, as armed rebellions broke out in 1911 and 12, with particularly threatening insurrections led by Emiliano Zapata in Morelos and Pascual Orozco in the north. Both Zapata and Orozco had led revolts that put pressure on Diaz to resign. Both felt betrayed by Madero once he became president. The press embraced its newfound freedom, and Madero became a target of its criticism. Organized labor, which had been suppressed under Diaz, could and did stage strikes, which foreign entrepreneurs saw as threatening to their interests. The number of political parties grew, and one of the most important was the National Catholic Party, which in several regions of the country was particularly strong. During Madero's presidency, the church-state conflict was channeled peacefully. The National Catholic Party became an important political opposition force during the Madero presidency. In the June 1912 congressional election, the Catholic Party did well. During that period, the Catholic Association of Mexican Youth was founded. Although the National Catholic Party was in opposition to the Madero regime, Madero clearly welcomed the emergence of a kind of two-party system, Catholic and liberal. He encouraged Catholic political involvement. Madero did not have the experience or the ideological inclination to reward men who had helped bring him to power. Some revolutionary leaders expected personal rewards, such as Pascual Orozco of Chihuahua. Others wanted major reforms, most especially Emiliano Zapata and Andrés Molina Enriquez, who had long worked for land reform. Madero met personally with Zapata, telling the guerrilla leader that the land reform question needed more careful study. To Zapata, his meaning was clear, however. Madero, a member of a rich northern hacendado family, was not about to implement comprehensive land reform for aggrieved peasants. In response to this lack of action, Zapata established the Plan de Ayala in November of 1911. Declaring himself in rebellion against Madero, he renewed guerrilla warfare in the state of Morelos. Madero sent the federal army to deal with Zapata. They were unsuccessful. Zapata remained true to the demands of the Plan de Ayala, and in rebellion against every central government during the revolutionary period. In it, Zapata denounced President Francisco Madero for his perceived betrayal of the revolutionary ideals embodied in Madero's Plan de San Luis Potosi, and set out his own vision of land reform. The northern revolutionary general, Pascual Orozco, a leader in taking Ciudad Juárez, had expected to become governor of Chihuahua. Although Orozco was the quote-unquote man of the hour, Madero gave the governorship instead to Abraham González, a respectable revolutionary, with the explanation that Orozco had not reached the legal age to serve as governor, a tactic that was quote-unquote a useful constitutional alibi for thwarting the ambitions of young, popular revolutionary leaders. Madero had put Orozco in charge of a large force of rurales in Chihuahua, but to a gifted revolutionary fighter who had helped bring about the fall of Diaz, Orozco found Madero's reward insulting. After Madero refused to agree on social reforms, calling for better working hours, pay, and conditions, Orozco organized his army, the Oroquistas, also called the Colorados, Red Flaggers, and issued his Plan de Oroquista on March 25, 1912, explaining why he was rising in revolt against Madero. In April of 1912, Madero dispatched General Victoriano Huerta of the Federal Army to put down Orozco's dangerous revolt. Madero had kept the army intact as an institution, using it to put down domestic rebellions against his regime. Huerta was a professional soldier and continued to serve in the army under the new commander-in-chief. Huerta's loyalty lay with General Bernardo Reyes rather than the civilian Madero. In 1912, under pressure from his cabinet, Madero called on Huerta to suppress Orozco's rebellion. With Huerta's success against Orozco, he emerged as a powerful figure for conservative forces opposing the Madero regime. During the Orozco revolt, the governor of Chihuahua mobilized the state militia to support the federal army. Pancho Villa, now a colonel in the militia, was called up at this time. In mid-April, at the head of 400 regular troops, he joined the forces commanded by Huerta. Huerta, however, viewed Villa as an ambitious competitor. During a visit to Huerta's headquarters in June of that year, after an incident in which he refused to return a number of stolen horses, Villa was imprisoned on charges of insubordination and robbery, and was sentenced to death. Raúl Madero, the president's brother, intervened to save Villa's life. Jailed in Mexico City, Villa escaped and fled to the United States, later to return and play a major role in the events from 1913 to 1915. There were other rebellions as well, one led by Bernardo Reyes, and another by Felix Diaz, the nephew of former President Diaz. Those rebellions were quickly put down and the generals were jailed. They both were in Mexico City prisons, and despite their geographical separation, they were able to foment another rebellion in February of 1913. The coup began on February 9th and ended on the 19th. This period became to be known as La Decena Trágica, 10 Tragic Days, which ended with Madero's resignation and assassination, and Huerta assuming the presidency. In the 10 days of violence, the aim was to create the illusion of chaos necessary to induce Madero to step down from the presidency. The coup was strongly supported by U.S. Ambassador to Mexico by the name of Henry Lane Wilson, who opposed Madero. Madero retained the Mexican Federal Army after rebels had forced the resignation of President Diaz, but Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz had been plotting together to overthrow Madero. They sought to bring in General Huerta, but they did not offer him enough incentives to join. However, once the rebel uprising began, Huerta secretly joined the plot. On February 9th, an army led under General Manuel Mondragon gathered at the civilian penitentiary and demanded that Felix Diaz be set free. After the commander of the penitentiary was killed, he was freed. They then went to Santiago Tlatelolco military prison, where they demanded and secured the release of General Reyes. When released, General Reyes mounted a horse and led part of the cadets in a column of soldiers to the National Palace, arriving there at 7:30 a.m. Reyes appeared to have full confidence that he would be welcomed. He rode to its gate, quote, as if on parade. Then Reyes was fired upon and fell from his horse mortally wounded. The men behind him scattered, and many spectators were killed in the confused shooting that followed. When the firing ceased, 400 lay dead and over 1,000 were wounded. Among them was General Villard, the military commander. A bullet cut through his collarbone. The Mexican Secretary of War, Ángel García Peña, was shot through the arm. President Madero was in the presidential residence at Chapultepec Castle, 3 miles away from the initial fighting. He received word of the coup at 8 a.m. Madero mounted a horse and with a small escort, including the Secretaries of Finance and Treasury, rode into the city. Arriving at the end of the broad Avenida Juárez and finding the narrower streets, he dismounted and went into a photographer's studio opposite the unfinished Teatro Nacional, National Theater, to telephone for later news. There he was joined by a few citizens and army officers. Among them was Victoriano Huerta, who was on inactive duty due to an eye condition. Huerta had been considered in disfavor and was known to be resentful at not having been made Madero's Minister of War. Madero, on his part, had reservations about Huerta, who was an efficient but brutal officer with serious drinking problems. Huerta offered his services to Madero, and since General Villard and Secretary of War Peña were injured, his services were accepted. Huerta was appointed commander of the Army of the Capital. The commission was made formal on the following day. The assault on the palace failed because Madero loyalist General Lauro Villard, the commandant of the palace guard, was walking in civilian clothes to his office in the early morning when he observed a detachment of cadets dragging a machine gun with them. Thus he was able to give the alarm and have his men in readiness. Madero left the presidential residence at Chapultepec Castle with a contingent of cadets from the nearby military academy. They left for the National Palace and encountered General Huerta. General Villard was wounded in the initial fighting, and Madero offered the command of the palace guard to Huerta. However, Madero was not entirely confident of Huerta and left for Cuernavaca to consult General Felipe Angeles. By this time, General Felix Diaz had heard about Reyes' death and contacted U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson. General Felix Diaz had been more successful than General Reyes. As a result of the resistance at the presidential palace, Diaz retreated to the city arsenal, the Ciudadela, a few blocks from the presidential palace. He took control of the armory without much opposition, and found himself in possession of a defensible fort, with the government's reserve of arms and ammunition. From the Ciudadela, the rebels began bombarding downtown Mexico City with their cannons, aiming for the National Palace. On February 11th at about 10 a.m., Huerta began the bombardment of the arsenal, which was met with a vigorous rebel response, and the downtown area between the National Palace and the arsenal was heavily damaged. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire for 8 hours. During the day, other government reinforcements arrived, along with a supply of ammunition from Veracruz. General Huerta, in charge of the guard of the National Palace, met with Felix Diaz in a private home in the Roma section of Mexico City. It was in this meeting where Huerta declared his support for the coup. At this point, Huerta had not made his change of loyalty public. He then directed the 18 Corps of Rurales to expose positions near the arsenal, where they suffered heavy casualties under machine gun fire from the rebels. Whether it was the result of misjudgment or deliberate betrayal, Huerta's actions significantly weakened the forces loyal to Madero. As the conflict unfolded, the governor of Coahuila, Venustiano Carranza, offered Madero refuge in Saltillo. The U.S. ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, however, on this day told all visitors at the embassy that the Madero government had practically fallen, and telegraphed President William Howard Taft, asking for powers to force the combatants to negotiations. The mutual bombardment continued on to the next day. Ambassador Wilson conferred with the Spanish and German ministers, as his report to the State Department that day states, quote, "Protested against the continuance of hostilities. The President," continues Ambassador Wilson's report, quote, "was visibly embarrassed and endeavored to fix the responsibility on General Felix Diaz." Ambassador Wilson now took the view that President Madero, by not surrendering instantly to the rebels, was responsible for the bloodshed. The view was shared to the Spanish minister and later to the British and German ministers. Ambassador Wilson said that he called into the consultation, on this and subsequent occasions, only his British, Spanish, and German colleagues, because they represented the largest interest in Mexico, and quote, "the others did not really matter." At another time, Mr. Wilson explained that it would have been difficult to contact all of his colleagues, so he only consulted with those representing the larger interests. On February 15th, Ambassador Wilson requested the British, German, and Spanish ministers to come to the embassy. He did not invite the other members of the diplomatic corps. He reported to Secretary Knox, quote, "We have considered the question of making direct representation to Madero, relating to his resignation to save further bloodshed, and possible international complications. The opinion of my assembled colleagues was unanimous and clear, that we should at once, even without instructions, take this action to terminate this intolerable situation, and turn over the executive power to Congress." The Spanish minister was designated to visit the National Palace, and informed the President of this unanimous opinion of the diplomats that he should resign. President Madero replied to the Spanish minister that he did not recognize the right of the diplomatists, accredited to a nation to interfere in its domestic affairs. He called attention to the fact, which he feared some diplomatists may have somehow overlooked, was that he was the constitutional president of Mexico, and declared that his resignation would plunge the country into political chaos. He said he might be killed, but he would not resign. Madero sent an angry message to U.S. President Taft. Taft had denied Ambassador Wilson plenary powers to act in Mexico, so Wilson's actions were as if he had such powers. Taft replied that President Madero must have misunderstood the message, that there was going to be no imminent armed intervention from the U.S. A biographer of General Huerta, Michael C. Mayer, sees February 15th events as encouraging to Huerta, who, quote, "wanted the Madero government to fall, but was concerned that he might not be given a prominent position in either the peace negotiations or the interim government to follow." Later that same day, Ambassador Wilson went to the palace, accompanied by the German minister. Their objective was to, quote, "confer with General Huerta." But as he goes on, quote, "Upon arrival, much to our regret, we were taken to see the president. Huerta was called in, however, and an armistice was agreed upon. At the Gambrinus restaurant at noon, the president's brother, Gustavo Madero, was arrested. After breakfast with Huerta and other men, who at the conclusion of the meal seized him and held him prisoner. The plan of seizing the president was only delayed an hour or so. On Tuesday at 2 p.m., Ambassador Wilson had the satisfaction of telegraphing the State Department, quote, "My confidential messenger with Huerta has just communicated to me Madero's arrest." On the receipt of the messenger's report, that Tuesday afternoon, Ambassador Wilson sent a message to Felix Diaz at the arsenal, apprising him that President Madero had been arrested, and that Huerta desired to confer with the rebel chieftain. It was agreed to hold the conference at the U.S. Embassy at the invitation of the ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson. At 9 p.m., Huerta arrived at the embassy. Diaz, leader of the mutiny, Victoriano Huerta, the commander of Madero's forces, and the American ambassador spent the next 3 hours in conference in the smoking room of the U.S. Embassy. Agreeing to plan, known as the Pact of the Embassy, for a new government to succeed that of former President Madero. Diaz pressed his claims to the presidential office on the grounds that he had fought the battle, but Huerta's claims were stronger, for in truth, if he had not turned, the revolt could not have succeeded. Also at this time, Huerta had command of more troops than Diaz. 3 times they were on the verge of parting in anger, said Ambassador Wilson, but his labors kept them together, and they finally worked out what represented as a compromise. Huerta would become provisional president, but would call for an election in October and support Diaz for the permanent presidency. But Huerta did not honor his part of the agreement, and sent Diaz to Japan as an ambassador. On his return, Diaz was later exiled to New York City and then Havana. A cabinet was agreed on, Ambassador Wilson taking a leading part in this matter. The ambassador approved the appointment of Enrique Cepeda as the governor of the federal district, and stipulated for the release of Madero's ministers. Ambassador Wilson made no stipulation concerning the president and the vice president. That night, within an hour of the adjournment of the meeting at the embassy, Gustavo Madero, the president's brother, was driven into an empty lot just outside the arsenal. His body was riddled with bullets and thrown into a hole in the ground. General Huerta informed Ambassador Wilson and President Taft, quote, "I have the honor to inform you that I have overthrown this government. The armed forces support me, and from now on peace and prosperity will reign." And with that, the violence in downtown Mexico City was replaced by civilians flooding the streets, no longer worried for their safety. The building of the leading Maderista newspaper was set ablaze. Those who directed the coup saw the necessity for Madero and Pino Suarez to resign, so that there was some veneer of legality about the forced change of regime. Pino Suarez was promised safe passage from Mexico if he did resign. Both he and Madero did sign, but after that it was unclear what their fates would be. Leaving them alive would pose a great threat to the usurpers. Huerta asked the U.S. ambassador what should be done: send them into exile or place them in an insane asylum. The ambassador gave Huerta a free hand in the matter. Quote, "General, do what you think is best for the welfare of Mexico." General Huerta assumed the presidency on Thursday, February 20th, carefully observing formalities which are held to establish the legality of his rule. The president and vice president, having resigned, Madero's Minister of Foreign Relations, Pedro Lascorrain, was recognized as president for the few 45 minutes necessary for him to appoint Victoriano Huerta, Minister of the Interior, and then resign, leaving Huerta to succeed him as president according to the Constitution.
La Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos. Las leyes de reforma.
On the evening of February 20th, an artillery barrage was directed against the Ciudadela barracks, where Felix Diaz had established his base of operations. 300 Ruales of the 18th Corps rode down Baldera Street to attack the Ciudadela, but they were met by a machine gun fire and scattered. After losing 67 dead and wounded, it remains unclear whether the destruction of the 18th Corps was the result of a tactical blunder or a measure deliberately engineered by Huerta to weaken forces loyal to Madero. On February 22nd, Madero and Pino Suarez were told that they would be transferred to another prison, taken by car. They were assassinated nearby the walls of the Lecumberri prison, from which Felix Diaz had only recently been freed. The 2 assassins were federal officers Francisco Cardenas and Rafael Pimienta. According to historian Frederick Katz, it, quote, "is hotly debated whether they acted on their own or on orders from Huerta, and if Ambassador Wilson was involved or knew. But there is strong evidence that Huerta gave the order and that Wilson knew." Newspaper reporters waiting outside the palace had observed that Madero and Pino Suarez were put into 2 automobiles, one in each, at about 11:45 p.m. and were driven in the direction of the penitentiary, escorted by a dozen soldiers, under the command of Major Francisco Cardenas of the Ruales. The vehicles did not go to the door of the penitentiary, but instead passed the street leading to it and went to a vacant space in the back of the building. Here the automobile stopped and shots were heard. What had actually occurred will probably never be known exactly. Right after Madero's murder, his widow sought the return of his corpse. On February 24th, Madero was buried in a private grave in the French cemetery in Mexico City, and members of the Madero family went into exile. Madero's body remained in that cemetery until it was moved to the Monument to the Revolution in 1938.
En 1910, diremos año primero, comenzó la oposición de don Francisco y Madero. La cuestión que trae Madero con el señor don Porfirio es de defender la patria, porque nos había vendido. Ya les vendió los terrenos a los que tienen dinero, los pobres los que...
Both Huerta and his Minister of Foreign Relations stated that a formal inquiry would be made into the death of Madero. This, however, was not undertaken. Major Cardenas was put under arrest, but was soon released and promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was then placed in the command of the Ruales in Michoacán. Later, Cardenas fled to Guatemala when the Huerta government was overthrown. In 1920, the post-revolutionary Mexican government requested the extradition of Cardenas for the murder of Madero. Cardenas committed suicide before this could be undertaken. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson never made any demand for an investigation. Instead, the ambassador criticized Madero and his family. He boasted that he consistently predicted Madero's overthrow. In reply to questions as to whether it had been proper for a foreign diplomat to preside at a conference between two rebel generals and help arrange the details of a new presidency when the constitutional president to whom he was accredited was held prisoner, the ambassador replied that it was necessary for the good of Mexico that Madero was eliminated. Huerta was recognized by most Mexican state governors, but Venustiano Carranza, governor of Coahuila, refused and rose in rebellion against Huerta. Madero's martyrdom accomplished what he was unable to do while alive: unite all the revolutionists under one banner. Within 16 months, revolutionary armies defeated the federal army and the Huerta regime fell. Like Porfirio Diaz, Huerta went into exile. The federal army was disbanded, leaving only revolutionary military forces. Upon taking power, Huerta had moved swiftly to consolidate his hold in the north, having learned the lesson from Diaz's fall that the north was a crucial region to hold. Within a month of the coup, rebellions began to spread throughout Mexico, most prominently led by the governor of the state of Coahuila, Venustiano Carranza, along with Pablo González. Huerta expected state governors to fall into line with the new government, but Carranza and Abraham González, governor of Chihuahua, did not. Carranza issued the Plan of Guadalupe, a strictly political plan to reject the legitimacy of the Huerta government, and called on revolutionaries to take up arms. The revolutionaries who had brought Madero to power, only to be dismissed in favor of the federal army, were eager to respond to the call, most prominently Pancho Villa and Alvaro Obregón of Sonora. He became a successful rancher and businessman who had not participated in the Madero Revolution, but now joined the revolutionary forces in the north, the Constitutionalist Army under the Primer Jefe, First Chief, Venustiano Carranza. Huerta had Governor González arrested and murdered for fear he would foment rebellion. When Northern General Pancho Villa became governor of Chihuahua in 1914, following the defeat of Huerta, he located González's bones and had them reburied with full honors. In Morelos, Emiliano Zapata continued his rebellion under the Plan de Ayala, calling for expropriation of land and redistribution to peasants. Huerta offered peace to Zapata, who rejected it. The Huerta government was now challenged by both revolutionary forces in the northern part of Mexico, as well as the state of Morelos, just south of the capital. Huerta's presidency is usually characterized as a dictatorship. From the point of view of the revolutionaries of the time, and the construction of historical memory of the revolution, it is without any positive aspects. It was during this time, a new and later popular version of La Cucaracha was sung by the Villistas to parody Victoriano Huerta in his addictions to alcohol and marijuana. The song was also used later by different factions of the revolution to make fun of their opponents.
La cucaracha, ya no puede caminar, porque no tiene, porque le falta marihuana que fumar.
Supporting the Huerta regime initially were business interests in Mexico, both foreign and domestic. Land elites, the Roman Catholic Church, and the German and British governments all supported Huerta initially. The US President Woodrow Wilson, however, did not recognize the Huerta regime, since it had come to power by a coup. Huerta and Carranza were in contact for 2 weeks immediately after the February coup. But they did not come to an agreement. Carranza declared himself opposed to Huerta and became the leader of the anti-Huerta forces in the north. Huerta gained the support of Revolutionary General Pascual Orozco, who had helped topple the Diaz regime, then rebelled against Madero because of his lack of action on land reform issues. Huerta's first cabinet comprised of men who had supported the February 13th Pact of the Embassy. Among them were some who had supported Madero, such as Jesus Flores Mangon, supporters of General Bernardo Reyes, supporters of Felix Diaz, and the former interim president Francisco León de la Parra. Huerta was seemingly deeply concerned with the issue of land reform, since it was a persistent spur of peasant unrest. Specifically, he moved to restore ejido lands to the Yaquis and Mayos of Sonora, and advanced proposals for distribution of government lands to small-scale farmers. When Huerta refused to move faster on land reform, Molina Enriquez disavowed the regime in June of 1913. Despite the urging of American Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, who played a key role in the coup d'etat, President Wilson not only declined to recognize Huerta's government, but first supplanted the ambassador by sending his own personal representative, John Lind, who was a progressive who sympathized with Mexican revolutionaries, and the president also recalled Ambassador Wilson. The United States lifted the arms embargo imposed by Taft in order to supply weapons to the landlocked rebels. Wilson urged European powers not to recognize Huerta's government, and attempted to persuade Huerta to call prompt elections and not present himself as a candidate. The United States offered Mexico a loan on the condition that Huerta accept the proposal. He refused. Representative Lind, quote, clearly threatened a military intervention in case the demands were not met. Huerta closed the legislature on October 26th, having the army surround its buildings and arresting congressmen perceived to be hostile to his regime. Despite that, congressional elections went ahead, but given that Congress was dissolved and some members were in jail, opposition candidates' fervor disappeared. The sham election, quote, brought home to Wilson's administration the fatuity of relying on elections to demonstrate genuine democracy. The October 1913 elections were the end of any pretension to constitutional rule in Mexico, with civilian political activity banned, and prominent Catholics were arrested, and Catholic newspapers were suppressed. Huerta militarized Mexico to a greater extent than it already was. When Huerta seized power in 1913, the army had on the books approximately 50,000 men, but Huerta mandated the number to rise to 150,000, then 200,000. Finally, in spring of 1914, there were 250,000. Raising that number of men in so short of time would not occur with volunteers, and the army resorted to the leva, forced conscription. The revolutionary forces had no problem with voluntary recruitment, but were against forced conscription. Most Mexican men avoided government conscription at all costs. The ones dragooned into the forces were sent to areas far away from home and were reluctant to fight. There were conscripts who deserted, mutinied, attacked, and murdered their officers. In April 1914, American opposition to Huerta culminated in the seizure and occupation of the port of Veracruz by U.S. Marines and sailors. It was initially intended to prevent a German merchant vessel from delivering a shipment of arms to the Huerta regime. The muddled operation evolved into a stalemate lasting 7 months, resulting in the deaths of 103 Mexican soldiers, 19 American servicemen, and an unknown number of civilians. The German ship landed its cargo, which mostly contained American-made rifles, from a deal brokered by an American businessman at a different port. The American forces eventually left Veracruz in the hands of the Carrancistas, but with lasting damage to U.S.-Mexican relations. In Mexico's south, Zapata took Chilpancingo Guerrero in mid-March. He soon followed with the capture of Pacific Coast ports of Acapulco, Iguala, Taxco, and Buena Vista de Cuellar. He confronted the federal garrisons in Morelos, the majority of which defected to him with their weapons. Finally, he moved against the capital by sending his subordinates into Mexico State. Constitutionalist forces made major gains against the federal army. In early 1914, Pancho Villa had moved against the federal army in the border town of Ojinaga, Chihuahua, sending the federal soldiers fleeing to Fort Bliss in the U.S. state of New Mexico. In mid-March, he took Torreon, a well-defended rail hub city, after bitter fighting for the hills surrounding Torreon. In later point-blank bombardment, on April 3rd, Villa's troops entered the devastated city. The Federal Army made a last stand at San Pedro de las Colonias, only to be undone by squabbling between two commanding officers, General Velasco and General Mas, over who had the higher rank. As of mid-April, Mexico City sat undefended before the Constitutionalist forces under Villa. Obregón moved south from Sonora, along the Pacific coast. When his way was blocked by federal gunboats, Obregón attacked these boats with an airplane, which was an early use of an airplane for military purposes. In early July, he defeated federal troops at Orendain, Jalisco, leaving 8,000 Federals dead, and capturing a large trove of arms. He was now in a position to arrive at Mexico City ahead of Villa, who was diverted by orders from Carranza to take Saltillo. Carranza, the civilian first chief, and Villa, the bold and successful commander of the Division of the North, were on the verge of splitting. Obregón, the other highly successful Constitutionalist general, sought to keep the Northern coalition intact. The Federal Army's defeat caused Huerta's position to continue to deteriorate. In mid-July of 1914, he stepped down and fled to the Gulf Coast port of Puerto Mexico, seeking to get himself and his family out of Mexico, rather than face the fate of Madero. He turned to the German government, which generally supported his presidency. The Germans were not eager to allow him to be transported into exile on one of their ships, but relented. In exile, Huerta sought to return to Mexico via the United States. American authorities arrested him, and he was imprisoned in Fort Bliss, Texas. He died in January 1916, 6 months after going into exile. Huerta's resignation marked the end of an era. The Federal Army, an ineffective fighting force against the revolutionaries, ceased to exist. The revolutionary factions that had united in opposition to Huerta's regime now faced a new political landscape, with counter-revolutionaries decisively defeated. The revolutionary armies now contended for power, and a new era of civil war began, after an attempt to make an agreement among the winners at the Convention of Aguascalientes. On July 28, 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. Foreign powers, with significant economic and strategic interests in Mexico, particularly the US, Great Britain, and Germany, made efforts to sway Mexico to their side, but Mexico maintained a policy of neutrality. With Huerta gone in July 1914, and the dissolution of the Federal Army in August, the revolutionary factions agreed to meet and make, quote, a last-ditch effort to avert more intense warfare than that of which unseated Huerta. Commander of the Division of the North, Pancho Villa, and the Division of the Northeast, Pablo González, had drawn up the Pact of Torreón in early July, pushing for a more radical agenda than Carranza's Plan of Guadalupe. It also called for a meeting of revolutionary generals to decide Mexico's political future. Carranza called for a meeting in October of 1914 in Mexico City, which he now controlled with Obregón. But other revolutionaries opposed Carranza's influence and successfully moved the venue to Aguascalientes. The Convention of Aguascalientes did not reconcile the various factions in the Mexican Revolution. The break between Carranza and Villa became definitive during the convention. Quote, Carranza spurned it, and Villa effectively hijacked it. Mexico's lesser caudillos were forced to choose between the two forces. It was a brief pause in revolutionary violence, before another all-out period of civil war ensued. Opposition to Carranza was strongest in the areas where there are popular and fierce demands for reform, particularly in Chihuahua, where Villa was powerful, and in Morelos, where Zapata held sway. The Convention of Aguascalientes brought that opposition out in an open forum. The revolutionary generals of the convention called on Carranza to resign executive power. Although he agreed to do so, he laid out conditions for it. He would resign if both Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, his main rivals for power, would resign and go into exile, and that there would be a so-called pre-constitutionalist government, quote, that would take charge of carrying out the social and political reforms the country needs before a fully constitutional government is re-established. Rather than First Chief Carranza being named President of Mexico at the convention, Eulalio Gutierrez was chosen for a term of 20 days. The convention declared Carranza in rebellion against it, and the civil war resumed, this time between the revolutionary armies that fought together against Huerta in 1913 and 14. During the convention, Constitutionalist General Alvaro Obregón had attempted to be a moderating force, and had been the one to convey the convention's call for Carranza to resign. The lines were now drawn. When the convention forces declared Carranza in rebellion against it, Obregón supported Carranza rather than Villa and Zapata. Villa and Zapata went into a loose alliance. Their forces moved separately onto Mexico City, and took it when Carranza's forces evacuated in December 1914 for Veracruz.
Donde se cruzan destinos, uno venía del estado, el otro de los caminos, se encontraron frente a frente, orgullo de campesinos. Emiliano, traje de manta.
The famous picture of Zapata and Pancho Villa in the National Palace, with Villa sitting in the presidential chair, is a classic image of the revolution. There are accounts that Villa insisted on taking turns in sitting in the presidential chair at the National Palace. It could be perceived that he viewed the symbolic act of sitting in the chair as triumph over the old regime and a way for revolutionary leaders to briefly hold authority. However, based on other accounts, it seems that Zapata had a different perspective. He allegedly stated, quote, "We should burn that chair to end all ambitions, believing that the throne itself corrupted those who sat in it." Pancho Villa is also reported to have said to Zapata that, quote, "The presidential chair is too big for us." In practice, the alliance between Villa and Zapata, as the army of the convention, did not function beyond this initial victory against the constitutionalists. Villa and Zapata left the capital, with Zapata returning to his southern stronghold in Morelos, where he continued to engage in warfare under the Plan de Ayala. Lacking a firm center of power and leadership, the convention government was plagued by instability. Villa was the real power emerging from the convention, and he prepared to strengthen his position by winning a decisive victory against the constitutionalist army. Villa had a well-earned reputation as a fierce and successful general, and the combination of forces arrayed against Carranza by Villa, other northern generals, and Zapata was larger than the constitutionalist army, so it was not at all clear that Carranza's faction would prevail. He did have the advantage of the loyalty of General Alvaro Obregón. Despite Obregón's moderating actions at the convention of Aguascalientes, even trying to persuade Carranza to resign his position, he ultimately sided with Carranza. Another advantage of Carranza's position was the constitutionalist control of Veracruz, even though the United States still occupied it. The United States had concluded that both Villa and Zapata were too radical and hostile to its interests, and sided with the moderate Carranza in the factional fighting. The U.S. timed its exit from Veracruz, brokered at the Niagara Falls Peace Conference, to benefit Carranza. The U.S. granted Carranza's government diplomatic recognition in October of 1915. The rival armies of Villa and Obregón clashed in April of 1915 in the Battle of Celaya, which lasted from the 6th to the 15th. The frontal cavalry charges of Villa's forces were met by the shrewd, modern military tactics of Obregón. After the Battle of Celaya, the Battle of Trinidad occurred, which lasted for 38 days, with thousands of casualties on both sides. Villa was again defeated by Obregón, who had lost his right arm in the fight. It was severed above the elbow by an artillery shell. The surgeons barely managed to save his life. His severed hand was put in a jar of formaldehyde, preserved by his doctor initially. Later, after his assassination, the hand was put on display at the Obregón Monument at the Park of Bombilla, where it remained until 1989, where it was cremated, and a sculpture of the arm now marks the site. The victory of the Constitutionalists was complete, and Carranza emerged as the political leader of Mexico, with a victorious army to keep him in that position. Villa retreated north. Carranza and the Constitutionalists consolidated their position as the winning faction, with Zapata remaining a threat until his assassination in 1919. Villa also remained a threat to the Constitutionalists, complicating their relationship with the United States when elements of Villa's forces raided Columbus, New Mexico in March of 1916, prompting the U.S. to launch a punitive expedition into Mexico in an unsuccessful attempt to capture him. Carranza sought to consolidate his position. The Constitutionalists retook Mexico City, which had been held by the Zapatistas, and held it permanently. He did not take the title of provisional or interim president of Mexico, since in doing so, he would have been ineligible to become constitutional president. Until the establishment of the 1917 Constitution, he was framed as the, quote, pre-constitutional government. Disorder and violence in the countryside was largely due to anti-Carranza forces, but banditry, as well as military and police misconduct, contributed to the unsettling situation. The government's inability to keep order gave an opening to supporters of the old order headed by Felix Diaz, nephew of Porfirio Diaz. Some 36 generals of the dissolved Federal Army stood with Diaz. The Constitutionalist Army was renamed the Mexican National Army, and Carranza sent some of its most able generals to eliminate threats. In Morelos, he sent General Pablo Gonzalez to fight Zapata's Liberating Army of the South. Morelos was very close to Mexico City, so Zapata's control of it and parts of the adjacent state of Puebla made Carranza's government vulnerable. Carranza sent General Francisco Murguia and General Manuel Dieguez to track down and eliminate Villa, but they were unsuccessful. They did, however, capture and execute one of Villa's top men, General Felipe Angeles, one of the only generals from the old Federal Army to join the revolutionaries. Autonomous fiefdoms arose, in which governors would simply ignore orders by the Carranza government. One of these was the governor of Sonora, General Plutarco Calles, who later joined the 1920 successful coup against Carranza. The 1914 Pact of Torreon had contained far more radical language and promises of land reform in support of peasants and workers than Carranza's original plan. Carranza then issued the, quote, additions to the Plan of Guadalupe, which for the first time promised significant reform. He also issued a land reform law in 1915, drafted by Luis Cabrera, sanctioning the return of all village lands illegally seized in the contravention of an 1856 law, passed under Benito Juarez. The Carranza reform declared village lands were to be divided among individuals, aiming to create a class of smallholders, not to revive the old structure of communities of communal landholders. In practice, the land was transferred not to the villagers, but rather distributed to constitutional army generals, which created new large-scale enterprises as rewards to the victorious military leaders. Carranza did not move on land reform, despite his rhetoric. Rather, he returned confiscated estates to their owners. Not only did he oppose large-scale land reform, he vetoed laws that would have increased agricultural production by giving peasants temporary access to lands not under cultivation. In places where peasants had fought for land reform, Carranza's policy was to repress them and deny their demands. Carranza's relationship with the United States had initially benefited from its recognition of his government, and with the Constitutionalist Army being able to buy arms. In 1915 and early 1916, there is evidence that Carranza was seeking a loan from the U.S., but Villa's raid against Columbus, New Mexico, in March of 1916, ended the possibility of a closer relationship with the U.S. Under pressure from public opinion in the U.S. to punish the attackers, President Woodrow Wilson sent General John J. Pershing and around 5,000 troops into Mexico in an attempt to capture Villa. The U.S. Army intervention, known as the Punitive Expedition, was limited to the western Sierras of Chihuahua. From the Mexican perspective, as much as Carranza sought the elimination of his rival Villa, a Mexican nationalist like him knew that he could not allow the U.S. incursion into his sovereign territory. Villa knew the terrain intimately, and operating with guerrilla tactics, he had little trouble evading the U.S. Army. Villa was deeply entrenched in the mountains of northern Mexico and knew the terrain too well to be captured. The U.S. Army also enlisted a regiment of Buffalo soldiers and Apache scouts to track down Villa. American General John J. Pershing could not continue with his unsuccessful mission. He declared victory, and the troops returned to the U.S. nearly after a year. They were shortly thereafter deployed to Europe when the U.S. entered World War I on the side of the Allies. The punitive mission not only damaged the fragile U.S.-Mexico relationship, but also caused a rise in anti-American sentiment among the Mexicans. Carranza asserted Mexican sovereignty and forced the U.S. to withdraw in 1917. In the Zimmermann Telegram, a coded cable from the German government to Carranza's government, Germany attempted to draw Mexico into war with the United States, which itself was neutral at the time. Germany hoped to draw American troops from deployment to Europe, and as a reward in the event of a German victory, it would return the territory Mexico lost to the U.S. in the Mexican-American War. Carranza did not pursue this policy, but the leaking of the telegram pushed the US into war against Germany in 1917. On February 5, 1917, a new constitution was approved by Congress. It included things such as increased labor rights, land redistribution, national resource sovereignty, a separation of church and state, and other political reforms. The Villistas and Zapatistas were excluded from the Congress, but their political challenge pushed delegates to radicalize the Constitution, which in turn was more radical than Carranza himself. While he was elected constitutional president in 1917, he did not implement its most revolutionary elements, particularly those dealing with land reform. Carranza came from the old Porfirian landowning class and was repulsed by peasant demand for redistribution of land and their expectation that land seized would not revert to their previous owners. In December 1916, Villa had captured the major northern city of Torreon. Zapata and his peasant followers in Morelos also never put down their guns and remained a threat to the government in Mexico City. Incorporating radical aspects of Villa's program and Zapata's Plan de Ayala, the Constitution became a way to outflank the two opposing revolutionary factions. Obregón returned to Sonora and began building a power base that would launch his presidential campaign in 1919, which included the new labor organization headed by Luis Morones, the Regional Confederation of Mexican Workers. Carranza increasingly lost support of labor, crushing strikes against his government. Carranza did not move forward on land reform, fueling increasing opposition from peasants. On April 10th of 1919, in Chinameca, Emiliano Zapata was assassinated in an ambush by the orders of Carranza. A government colonel by the name of Jesus Guajardo, who was under the orders of General Pablo González, was tasked by Carranza to defeat Zapata. Guajardo pretended to defect from the army and was able to arrange a meeting with Zapata at the hacienda in Chinameca. He was promising to join Zapata's cause. When Guajardo gave the signal, after Zapata arrived at the hacienda, he and some of his men were shot and killed by Carranza's soldiers. After this occurred, there was widespread sorrow and even disbelief. Many of the peasants believed for many years that Zapata was still alive and that he escaped. It also further enraged the Zapatistas and those who aligned with Zapata as well. Pancho Villa saw the event as a dishonorable and cowardly act. It only furthered his hatred for Carranza. Although Zapata was assassinated, the land reform the peasants themselves enacted in Morelos were impossible to reverse. The central government came to terms with the state of affairs. Zapata had fought for land and for those who lived in it in Morelos and succeeded. His credentials as a steadfast revolutionary made him an enduring hero of the revolution.
Morelos ya no es el mismo, su herencia vive en el surco, en cada ejido y parcela que ya no tiene verdugo. Y sombran en los cañales, su fe en la gente se siente. Zapata no se ha muerto, Zapata sigue presente. Ay, ay, hacienda de Chinameca, manchada de sangre.
Even years after his assassination, his name and image were invoked in the 1994 uprising in Chiapas, with the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Even as Carranza's political authority was waning, he attempted to impose Mexico's ambassador to the U.S., Ignacio Bonillas, as his successor. On April 22, 1920, El Plan de Agua Prieta was declared by three revolutionary generals from Sonora, Alvaro Obregón, Plutarco Calles, and Adolfo de la Huerta. It was a plan that articulated the reasons for rebellion against the government of Carranza. The plan's stated pretext for rejecting the Carranza administration was a dispute between the federal government and the Sonora state government over control of the waters in the Sonora River. Although the underlying reasons were complex, Carranza and the revolutionary generals who controlled the state of Sonora were increasingly in conflict. Carranza was in the process of centralizing power and saw Sonora as too independent of central government control and moved to stop its autonomy. Such a move, in addition to impose a civilian as his successor, angered the revolutionary generals. They saw Carranza's maneuvering as a way of trying to outflank the men who had won the Mexican Revolution, and they were not willing to allow a civilian nobody to come into power in 1920. The plan empowered De La Huerta to appoint interim governors in those states that aligned with or were defeated by the liberal constitutionalist army. It called on state governments to appoint representatives to a junta meeting, which would then select an interim president of the republic. The interim president would, immediately upon assuming office, call for a fresh general election. Support for the plan was widespread across the country. More than 3/4 of the army rejected Carranza and joined the rebellion. As De La Huerta's liberal constitutionalist army made progress towards Mexico City, Carranza refused to negotiate or surrender and fled the capital by train in May of 1920. He was headed for the port of Veracruz, where he intended to set up a temporary seat of government as he held earlier during the revolution. The train was attacked repeatedly as it left the capital and arriving at Aljibes, Puebla, and was unable to continue because of the sabotage of the tracks. In addition, Carranza had learned that the military commander of Veracruz, Guadalupe Sanchez, had gone over to the rebels. Carranza and a small group of followers were forced to change plans. They would head north on horseback, perhaps to Carranza's home state of Coahuila, where his support might be stronger. On horseback, they began a crossing of the Sierra Norte, and on May 20th reached a town in the state of Puebla. A rebel ambush in the early hours of May 21st, allegedly led by General Rudolfo Herrero, left President Carranza dead, either assassinated by the rebels or by suicide. Carranza's disposition was considered the last coup d'etat in Mexican history.
Don Venustiano Carranza, gobernador de Coahuila, por defender la razón, trae en peligro su vida.
Adolfo de la Huerta was appointed interim president. He served from June 1st to November 30th of 1920. He was succeeded by Alvaro Obregón, who was elected the constitutional president in September of 1920. The interim government of Adolfo de la Huerta negotiated Pancho Villa's surrender in 1920. They rewarded him with a hacienda in Tarango, where he lived in peace until he floated in political interest in the 1924 election. Although the 1917 constitution was not fully implemented, parts of the country were still controlled by local strongmen, caciques. Obregón's presidency did begin consolidation of parts of the revolutionary agenda, which included expanding rights of the labor force and the peasantry. Obregón was a pragmatist, not an idealist, so he knew that domestically he had to appeal to both the left and right to ensure Mexico would not fall back into civil war. Securing labor rights built on Obregón's existing relationship with urban labor. The Constitutionists made an alliance with labor during the revolution, mobilizing the Red Battalions against Zapata and Villa's forces. This alliance continued under Obregón and Calles' terms as presidents. Obregón also focused on land reform. He had governors in various states push forward the reforms promised in the 1917 Constitution. These were, however, quite limited. Former Zapatistas still had strong influence in the post-revolutionary government, so most of the reforms began in Morelos, the birthplace of the Zapatista movement. Obregón's government was faced with the need for stabilizing Mexico after a decade of civil war. With the revolutionary armies having defeated the old federal army, Obregón now dealt with military leaders who were wielding power violently. Enticing them to leave the political arena in exchange for material rewards was one tactic. De la Huerta had already successfully used it with Pancho Villa, but Obregón didn't trust Villa to remain on the sidelines, probably due to their past conflicts during Carranza's regime. Villa was seen as a political threat to his regime, so Obregón had him assassinated in 1923. On July 20th of 1923, Villa was shot and killed in an ambush while visiting Parral. He frequently made trips from his ranch to Parral, where he generally felt secure, for banking and other errands. Villa was usually accompanied by his large entourage of armed dorados, or bodyguards. But on that day, he had gone into town without most of them, taking with him only 3 bodyguards and 2 other ranch employees. He went to pick up gold from a local bank, which he was going to use to pay his Canutillo ranch staff. While driving back through the city, in his black 1919 Dodge touring car, Villa passed by his school. Then a pumpkin seed vendor ran towards his car and shouted, "Viva Villa!" This was a signal to a group of 7 riflemen who then appeared in the middle of the road and fired more than 40 shots into the automobile. Villa was hit in the head and upper chest, killing him instantly. His bodyguards and chauffeur were also killed. Ramon Contreras was wounded badly, but managed to kill at least one of the assassins before he escaped. Contreras was the only survivor. Villa is reported to have died saying, quote, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." But there's no contemporary evidence that he survived his shooting, even momentarily.
Pancho Villa, que un día bajarás de tus azules montañas, de tus abruptas sierras.
Telegraph service was interrupted at Villa's hacienda of Canutillo, probably so Obregon's officials could secure the estate and to prevent a possible Villista uprising triggered by his assassination. The next day, Villa's funeral was held, and thousands of his grieving supporters in Parral followed his casket to his burial site, while Villa's men and his closest friends remained at Canutillo hacienda, armed and ready for an attack by government troops. The 6 surviving assassins hid out in the desert, and were soon captured, but only 2 of them served a few months in jail, while the rest were commissioned into the military. Villa was likely assassinated because he was talking publicly about re-entering politics as the 1924 elections neared. Obregón could not run again for the presidency, so there was political uncertainty about the presidential succession. Obregón favored fellow Sonoran general Plutarco Calles for the presidency. If Villa did re-enter politics, it would complicate the political situation for Obregón and the Sonoran generals. Assassinating Villa benefited the plans of Obregón, who wanted to choose someone who in no way matched his power and charisma, and Calles, who wanted to be president of Mexico at any cost. In 1923, De la Huerta rebelled against Obregón for his choice of Calles as his successor as president. Leading to a split in the military, the rebellion was suppressed, and Obregón began to professionalize the military, reducing the number of troops by half, and forcing officers to retire. Obregón, followed by Calles, viewed bringing the armed forces under state control as essential to stabilizing Mexico. Foreigners held extensive agricultural land claims that were now at risk to be distributed to landless Mexicans. Obregón and the U.S. entered in talks to sort out many issues. The Bucareli Treaty, which concluded in 1923, with the U.S. recognizing Obregón's government. In Mexico, the agreement was controversial, with it being perceived as making major concessions to the U.S. and undermining revolutionary goals, but Obregón pushed it through the legislature and gained American recognition. When his fellow Sonoran general, De la Huerta, rebelled later in 1923, the U.S. supplied Obregón with arms to put down the challenge. On December 1, 1924, Plutarco Calles was inaugurated as president. This was the first time since 1884 that there was a peaceful transition of power. In an attempt to buffer his regime against further coups, Calles began arming peasants and factory workers with surplus weapons. He continued other reforms pushed by his predecessor, but Calles was very anti-clerical, and unlike Obregón, who largely avoided direct conflict with the Catholic Church, Calles as president enforced the anti-clerical provisions of the 1917 Constitution. Calles also put into effect a national school system that was largely secular to combat church influence in late 1924. After 2 years of the state crackdown, the Catholic Church protested by going on its own version of a strike, refusing to baptize, marry, give last rites, or give communion to churchgoers. Many peasants also joined in opposition to the state's crackdown on religion, beginning the Cristero War, named for their battle cry, "Viva Cristo Rey," "Long live Christ the King." It was a lengthy major uprising against the revolutionary vision of the Mexican state in central Mexico. It was not a short-lived localized rebellion. In June 1926, Calles signed the law for reforming the Penal Code, which was popularly called the Calles Law. It provided specific penalties for priests and individuals who violated the provisions of the 1917 Constitution. For instance, wearing clerical garb in public, outside church buildings, earned a fine of 500 pesos, which was then the equivalent of $250, and priests who criticized the government could be imprisoned for 5 years. To help enforce the law, Calles expropriated church property, which included expelling all foreign priests, closing monasteries, convents, and religious schools. Later in 1926, Calles intensified tensions against the clergy by ordering all local churches in and around Jalisco to be bolted shut. The places of worship remained shut for 2 years. On July 14th, Catholic bishops endorsed plans for an economic boycott against the government, which is particularly effective in west-central Mexico. The government called the rebels Cristeros, since they invoked the name of Jesus Christ, under the title of Cristo Rey, Christ the King, and the rebels soon took to using the name themselves. The rebellion is also known for the Feminine Brigades of St. Joan of Arc, a brigade of women that assisted the rebels in smuggling guns and ammunition, and for certain priests who were tortured and murdered in public, which was later canonized by Pope John Paul II. The Gaius government failed at first to take the threat seriously, and the rebels did well against rural militia forces, but were always defeated by regular federal troops, who guarded the main cities. The rebels planned their battles fairly well, especially when it is considered that most of them had little to no previous military experience. The most successful rebel leaders were Jesus Degollado, a pharmacist, Victoriano Ramirez, a ranch hand, and two priests, Aristeo Pedrosa and Jose Reyes Vega. Reyes Vega was renowned, and Cardinal Davila called him a, quote, black-hearted assassin. At least 5 priests took up arms, and many others supported them in various ways. On August 3, 1926, 4 days after the Calles Law came into force, in Guadalajara, Jalisco, some 400 armed Catholics shut themselves in the Church of Our Lady at Guadalupe. They exchanged fire with federal troops and surrendered when they ran out of ammunition. According to American sources, the battle resulted in 18 dead and 40 wounded. On February 23, 1927, the Cristeros defeated federal troops for the first time at San Francisco de Rincon, Guanajuato, followed by another victory at San Julian, Jalisco. However, they quickly began to lose in the face of superior federal forces and retreated into remote areas. They consistently fled from federal soldiers. Most of the leadership of the revolt in the state of Jalisco was forced to flee the U.S., although Ramirez and Vega remained. The Cristero War ended through diplomatic negotiations, culminating in Los Arreglos, the arrangements. It was a peace treaty that was signed on June 21, 1929. It was brokered by U.S. Ambassador Dwight Morrow. The agreement allowed the Catholic Church to resume worship services and permitted clergy to petition for legal reforms, while the Church agreed to end its support for armed rebellion. Calles' strict enforcement of anti-clerical laws had an impact on presidential succession, with Calles' comrade and chosen successor ex-President Obregón being assassinated by a religious fanatic in 1928, plunging the political system into a major crisis. By law, Calles could not be re-elected, but a solution needed to be found to keep political power in the hands of the revolutionary elite and prevent the country from reverting to civil war. With the 1917 Constitution enshrining the principle of no re-election, revolutionaries who had fought for the principle could not ignore it. Elections were when disgruntled candidates for the presidency made their move, because it was a period of political transition. When Calles designated ex-President Obregón to succeed him, permitted by a constitutional amendment, the principle of no re-election was technically adhered to, but there was a clear possibility of an endless alternation of terms between the two powerful men. Obregón returned to the battlefield for the period of 1926 to April 1927, to put down a rebellion led by the Yaqui people. This was ironic, because Obregón had first risen to military prominence, commanding Yaqui troops, to whom he promised land, and the 1926 and 27 Yaqui rebellion was a demand for land reform. Obregón probably participated in this campaign to prove his loyalty to the Calles government and to show his continued influence over the military, also to protect his commercial interests in the Yaqui Valley, which had begun to suffer as a result of the increasing violence in the region. Obregón formally began his presidential campaign in May of 1927. Two of Obregón's oldest allies, General Arnulfo Gómez and General Francisco Serrano, opposed his re-election. Serrano launched an anti-Obregón rebellion. Gómez later called for an insurrection against Obregón, but was soon killed as well. As an ally of Calles, Obregón was hated by Catholics and was assassinated in La Bombilla Café on July 17, 1928, shortly after his return to Mexico City, by José de León Toral, a Roman Catholic who was opposed to the government's anti-Catholic policies. Toral entered the banquet honoring Obregón, posing as a caricaturist. He showed several sketches to those at the head table, including Obregón, who complimented his work, but as Obregón returned back to his meal, Toral drew a pistol and fired 5 or 6 shots into Obregón's back and head, killing him instantly at approximately 2:20 p.m. Toral's subsequent trial resulted in his conviction and execution by a firing squad. A Capuchin nun, Maria Concepcion Acevedo de la Llata, aka Madre Conchita, was implicated in the case and was thought to be the mastermind behind Obregón's murder. León Toral sought retribution for the execution of Miguel Pro, who was falsely convicted of attempting to assassinate Obregón a year prior. The assassination of Obregón plunged the country into a political crisis over presidential succession. A managed political situation to the crisis of presidential succession had to be found. The answer was the founding of the Partido Nacional Revolucionario. In 1929, Calles brought together the various factions, mainly regional strongmen. Calles himself could not be president again, but remained a powerful figure, the Jefe Máximo, which seemed like it was a function of being president in all but name. This period became to be known as the Maximato. From 1928 to 1934, three men, Emilio Portes Gil, Pascual Ortiz Rubio, Abelardo Rodriguez, held the presidency in what would have been Obregón's second term. There is some evidence suggesting that Calles had some influence in each of the three men's respective interim terms. To avoid alternation of the presidency by men who had previously held office, the Constitution was revised and reverted to the principle of no re-election. In 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas became president. The ultimate restabilization and reconstruction following the revolutionary period came during the term of Cárdenas.
Momentos antes de asumir la presidencia de la República, mi señora y yo enviamos a todos los elementos revolucionarios del país nuestro más cariñoso saludo, haciendo votos por la prosperidad de la nación.
Unlike his three predecessors controlled by Calles, Cárdenas threw off the Jefe Máximo's power and set about implementing a revitalized revolutionary agenda. He also exiled Calles, who was eventually allowed to return to Mexico in 1941, but died in 1945. He vastly expanded land reform, expropriated commercial land estates, nationalized the railways and the petroleum industry. He kept peace with the Catholic Church as an institution, and put down a major rebellion led by Saturnino Cedillo. He founded a new political party that created sectoral representation of industrial workers, peasants, urban office workers, and the army.
Nada puede justificar con más elocuencia la larga lucha de sacrificio de la Revolución Mexicana, como la existencia de regiones enteras en las que los hombres de México viven ajenos a toda civilización material y espiritual, hundidos en la ignorancia y la pobreza más absoluta, sometidos a una alimentación, a una indumentaria y a un alojamiento inferiores e impropios de un país que, como el nuestro, tiene los recursos materiales suficientes para asegurar una civilización más justa.
And engineered the succession of his hand-picked candidate. Then, perhaps the most radical act of all, stepped away from presidential power, letting his successor, General Manuel Avila Camacho, exercise full presidential power. His first acts of reform in 1935 were aimed towards peasants. Former strongmen within the landholding community were losing political power, so he began to side with the peasants more and more. He also tried to further centralize the government's power by removing regional caciques, allowing him to push reforms easier. To fill the political vacuum, Cárdenas helped the formation of PNR-sponsored peasant leagues, empowering both peasants and the government. Cárdenas left office in 1940, at age 45. His departure marked the end of the social revolution and ushering in half a century of relative stability. Now that we have covered the events from the revolution, let's see what the game and history have in common. Both Red Dead and the real Mexican Revolution depicted the mentality of social Darwinism that seemed to be present at the time. During the period of Porfiriato, the central belief was that individuals or groups who achieved power and wealth did so because they are innately the fittest, while those who are poor and marginalized are unfit and destined to fail. We can see in the real revolution as there was a social class caste system and hierarchy. It was used as a justification for unequal treatment of the peasantry class. At the time, it was mostly comprised of indigenous, mixed race, and black people. These groups, more often than not, did not have access to the same education or opportunities as the elite families of the time. In the game, you can see this mentality in a dialogue between John and Colonel Allende when he first meets him. Colonel Allende claims that they brought God and civilization, and the people turned their backs on him. He also calls them monkeys as well.
My people have lived and worked here for 100 years. We brought civilization. And these people, these fucking monkeys, despise us. We brought them God! And they turned their back on him. Now I fight to help them from themselves, to save them from themselves. I see in their faces that they would kill me if they could. Is she only a tyrant? That is the way it is. These people need a ruler.
Even Abraham Reyes has a similar mindset, thinking that he is better than the peasants because he came from a noble family. That is why he does not consider Luisa seriously for marriage, because to him, she is just a peasant girl to have fun with.
Luisa, the girl from Campo Murata?
A gentleman never tells, but she was a most wonderful... I just say she was increíble. Yes. Let me tell you something. I strongly recommend her. You take her when you have the chance, my brother.
She thinks she's your wife.
My wife? These peasant girls, they believe every word a fellow says. So naive. It's really quite charming. I love peasants. Don't you love peasants? I love them. They have such purity.
Are you gonna marry her?
Ha! Marry a peasant? My dear boy, don't be absurd. I'm going to be the next president of Mexico. My wife will meet ambassadors, kings, other great men. The very thought that I would marry some peasant girl with a tight gun and the hands of a farmer, well, I really don't think so. My mother, que Dios la cuide, would turn in her grave.
Both Red Dead and the real Mexican Revolution showed the issues with disparity between rich and poor, social, and land reform. The real revolution had an issue with disparity between rich and poor that was made worse during the period of Porfiriato because of the increases in foreign-owned estates or hacendados, and also the social class caste system that was established as previously mentioned. There was little to no opportunity for the average or even poor person to build wealth. There were also social issues like work conditions and paying Americans more than Mexicans as well. Land reform was the key issue that lasted throughout the entire revolutionary period, and is even still being disputed in some parts of Mexico today. In the game, Allende was abusing his power by taking land and selling it to aristocrats, or using it as a reward for loyalty. He also forced the peasants to work on that land for little to no pay, which is very similar conditions to the real revolution. Third, the game shows and even points out the revolutionary cycle that happened in real life. The real revolution seemed to have a cycle where someone would have many ideals and good intentions and would rebel against the existing government, but they would not establish those policies when they took power. They would more often than not be the same if not worse than the previous government before them. In the game, it has many quotes and themes about power and corruption. One of them was said by Landon Ricketts, who, when he's telling John about the situation in Mexico, says that this revolution is just like the last 2 or 3, where a leader promises the peasants freedom, but does not deliver.
It could be. This whole place is teeming with Americans on the run. Mercenaries, locals hell-bent on revolution.
Revolution? Another one?
Yeah. Never really ends. This whole place has been a hotbed for revolution since before the Spanish left. Now there's another local guy running around promising the peasants their freedom. Just like the last 2 or 3.
Another one is an undead nightmare, where Landon is talking about the things that he has seen in his life. One thing I think could apply to the revolution is where he says, quote, "I've seen slaves get set free and end up in a bondage more confusing than the one they left behind."
You know, John, I've lived a long life. I've seen this land when it was just wilderness and scrub. I've seen slaves get set free and return to a bondage even more confusing than the one they left behind.
Drew McFarland has another quote about power, which I believe could apply to the Mexican government in the game and during the revolutionary period. While riding with John and Bonnie, he says, quote, "Power is like a drink. The more you have, the more you want, and there are very few men who can handle it."
The government can go to hell if you ask me. Those sons of bitches would steal a coin off a dead man's eye.
Mr. Marston!
He's right. Now, I don't know much about politics.
Please, Paul, can we just enjoy
But I
the
know
ride?
we're only as free as they say we are. Power's like a drink. The more you have, the more you want. And there's few men who can handle it.
In history, and as the game showed, that power can corrupt anyone, even those who start out with good intentions. I think Zapata had a similar mindset, which is why he wanted to burn the presidential chair, to end all ambition. the significant role women had in both the game and in real life. In the real revolution, women played a very significant role. There were many in the armies of Pascual Orozco, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata. They were willing to fight and even die for change. One popular corrido during the period was called Adelita, which is based off of a real woman from most accounts.
Popular entre la tropa era Adelita, la mujer que el sargento idolatraba, porque más.
In the game, Luis is dedicated for and even dies for the revolution. But she is not the only woman. There are some other women in the Rebelde army in the game as well. And lastly, both the game and the real Mexican Revolution had foreign involvement. In the real revolution, there were foreign countries, such as the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and Spain that were involved. We can see that Ambassador Wilson helped overthrow Madero for perceived American interests, as well as the United States helping the Carranza government and leading an expedition against Pancho Villa into Mexico. In the game, Landon, Ricketts, and John, as Americans, become involved in the revolutionary conflict, but John did not involve himself for the interests of the American government. Rather, it happened as a byproduct of trying to capture Bill Williamson and Javier Escuella. And that is Red Dead Redemption and the Mexican Revolution. I hope you guys enjoy, and I hope you'll check out the Afterthoughts video I'll post with this, because if I put this all in one video, it'd be over 2 hours. In the Afterthoughts video, I kind of go over my thoughts about what I've learned, my thoughts about people during the revolution, and so yeah, so if you're interested in that, check that out. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll see you next time.